Look at him, still in his work boots, standing in a room like this one.
Some men just aren't built for rooms like this one. No shame in it. No shame in it at all.
I set my thermos down on the registration table and let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. Sylvia had no idea. The man in muddy boots behind her had signed the denial that would freeze the Cedar Hollow financing 9 days later. That signature was the only thing standing between Preston Ashworth's investors and a groundbreaking the county had already announced. My name is Marcus Delaine. I am 55 years old, and I am the only federally authorized reviewer for old-growth easements in 3 counties. 6 years before that morning, my grandfather had pressed a small brass pocket level into my palm and made me promise to carry it. That morning, it was sitting in my jacket pocket, same as every morning, unused the way it always was. If you have ever built something real with your hands, while the people closest to you introduced you like an inconvenient stay with me. Let me take you back 9 days, because that is really where this starts. I have spent most of my life believing one simple thing: that a man who does good work quietly will eventually be seen for it. I was wrong about the quietly part. 14 months before that hearing, on a gray Tuesday in October, I stood in Sylvia's kitchen holding a letter from the United States Forest Service. It named me the sole reviewer for the Cedar Hollow easement. The only man in 3 counties with the authority to sign off on it or shut it down. I set the letter face down on the counter and did not tell her what it said. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Looking back now, I think I was waiting to see if she'd ask. She never did. Part of me wanted to walk it over to her right there at the door and say, "Look what they trusted me with." The other part of me, the older part, remembered every time I'd tried to explain my work to her family. Their eyes always slid toward the television before I finished the sentence. So I folded the letter twice and put it in the drawer under the phone book, and I went out to my truck, same as any other morning. She was already halfway out the door to a showing keys in one hand, coffee in the other. She kissed my cheek without really looking at me the way she'd been doing for a while by then. We live on Delow Drive in Collier Heights. The kind of street where the oaks are older than the houses under them. On a Sunday, you can still smell somebody's greens, cooking 2 doors down, low and slow the way my grandmother used to make them. My grandfather's tool shed stands behind our house, even though he's been gone 11 years now. I mow around it instead of paving over the ground it sits on. Sylvia used to tease me about that, back when her teasing still had warmth folded into it. 2 blocks over on Cascade Road. There's a barber shop that's been open since before I was born. The men in there still call me Delaine's grandson, before they ever call me Marcus. I used to think that was a small thing. Some morning driving past it before a survey. It's the only thing that still makes me feel like I belong to somewhere in particular. And here is the part nobody in that ballroom knew, yet the part that had been sitting quiet in my truck for the better part of a year. 9 months of site surveys. 412 pages of soil composition data, canopy age rings, and root system mapping. All of it cross-referenced against the county's own conservation easement from 1981. One signature, mine, already written at the bottom of the recommendation, the ink barely dry. All of it locked in a steel case behind my truck seat, 6 miles from the room where Sylvia was about to laugh at my boots. I had walked every one of those 230 acres myself, twice, once in the spring and once after the first frost. I marked the oldest trees, some of them older than the county courthouse, with a strip of orange tape at eye level. Preston's people had walked it exactly once in dress shoes and left before the rain came in. Nobody at that mixer knew any of that. They only knew the boots. Cedar Hollow itself is a stand of tulip poplar and shortleaf pine that's been growing undisturbed since before the Civil War. A creek threads through it, still running clear enough to see crawfish moving along the bottom. The oldest tree on the property. A poplar the survey crew nicknamed the grandmother, measures 11 feet around at the base. I put my hand flat against her bark the first morning I walked that land. That's the way my grandfather taught me to greet a tree before I ever cut or cleared anything near it. Preston's renderings showed a spay pavilion standing exactly where she was rooted. My grandfather used to stand at the edge of that tool shed sawdust, clinging to the hair on his forearms. He said the same thing every fall, right? When the leaves started turning. Roots don't ask permission to hold the ground together. They just do it season after season, whether anybody up top is looking or not. I must have heard him say it 1,000 times before I understood what he meant by it. I thought for years he was talking about trees. He taught me to read a stand of hardwood the way other men read a room. Which trees were carrying the weight of the ones around them, and which ones were just borrowing light. By the time I was 14, I could tell you the age of an oak within 5 years just by the bark. By 16, I was climbing behind him on jobs. The county paid him for, under the table. Buddy would license a black man for tree work in that part of Georgia back then. He got his license, eventually framed it, and hung it in the tool shed instead of the house. This belongs out here with the work, he told me. Not in there with the company. I didn't understand that sentence either, not for a long time. There's a memory I carry from when I was about 10, standing next to my own father on somebody else's property line. It's one I still haven't told most people in my life. For 9 months after that letter arrived, I drove out to Cedar Hollow most Saturdays, while Sylvia was showing houses, telling her I had side jobs lined up. I logged every tree over 18 inches in diameter by hand in a composition notebook I kept locked in the glove box. The county's own database hadn't been updated since 2009. Some Saturdays it rained the whole time, and I worked anyway. Poncho zipped to my chin, because deadlines at the federal level don't bend for Georgia weather. Nobody asked where I disappeared to on those Saturdays. One of those Saturdays in late February, I slipped on wet leaf litter near the creek bank. I went down hard enough to knock the wind out of me for a full minute alone with my phone dead in the truck a quarter-mile back. I lay there staring up through bare branches longer than I probably needed to. It wasn't because I was hurt badly, but because something about lying flat on my back in that quiet made me think. Nobody in my life would have known where to look for me if I hadn't gotten up on my own. I got up. I finished the transect I'd started, drove home with a bruise the size of a dinner plate along my ribs. I told Sylvia I'd pulled something lifting mulch bags. She rubbed arnica gel into my side that night without asking many questions, gentle in a way that almost made the lie feel worth it. Nobody noticed I'd started coming home with a different kind of tired than the landscaping jobs used to leave in me. Sylvia had her own version of tired that year. It was the kind that comes from chasing a promotion that keeps sliding 6 months further out, no matter how many houses you sell. She'd started leaving for showings before 6 some mornings, blazer already pressed. A travel mug of black coffee she never finished sat in the cup holder by the time she got home. I used to wonder, watching her back out of the driveway in the dark, whether either of us had actually chosen the life we were living, or whether we'd just kept saying yes to the next thing until it became one. We were both running towards something neither of us had named out loud, in the same house most nights, not even in the same room while we did it. 3 weeks before the hearing, at a company mixer in Buckhead, I watched the shape of my marriage come into focus in about 90 seconds. Sylvia had asked me to come, said it would look good for her to have her husband there, and I'd put on the one blazer I own that isn't work clothes. "Still doing yard work, Marcus?" one of Sylvia's colleagues asked, swirling his glass, not really asking at all. "Still," I said. A second man leaned in, grinning like he'd rehearsed it. "Must be nice not having to wear a tie to work every day." Sylvia laughed along with both of them, a half-second too quick to be anything but practiced. I watched her do it and understood, not for the first time, that the laugh cost her nothing. She'd already decided what I was worth in a room like that one. Then Preston arrived. He shook every hand at that table, but mine working the group like he owned the air in it, and when he finally turned my way, he didn't offer his hand at all. "I keep telling Sylvia she married the wrong kind of ambitious," he said, loud enough for the whole table to catch it. Loud enough that nobody at that table corrected him. Not one person. Not even Sylvia. I picked up my water glass instead of saying anything. My grandfather taught me that a man who answers every insult ends up spending his whole life in other people's arguments. But I noted the date. I have always been a man who notes dates. My grandfather used to say, "A tree doesn't stop growing because somebody built a fence too close to it." It just grows around the fence slowly and outlives it. The drive home from that mixer took 20 minutes. Sylvia spent most of it scrolling through listings on her phone, the screen lighting up her face in the dark car. I didn't say anything about Preston's comment, and she didn't bring it up either. When we got home, I made 2 cups of coffee out of habit the way I do most nights and carried hers up to the bedroom. She was already asleep by the time I got there. I drank both cups myself, standing at the window, watching the porch light flicker. It had been doing that for weeks because neither of us had gotten around to fixing it. If you've ever come home with sawdust in the creases of your knuckles, stay with me. Somebody in that house probably asked if you were going to shower before dinner, like it was an accusation. You already know this feeling better than most people ever will. I know the exact weight of a thermos. 2 hours into a cold morning survey, how it gets lighter in a way that has nothing to do with the coffee. I know the particular quiet of a truck cab at 5:45 in the morning, heater ticking before anybody else in the house is even awake. I know what it is to eat a sandwich standing up at the kitchen counter at 11 at night, because some habits are older than the hurt that comes with them. My work boots live by the back door, not the front one, and I stopped noticing that arrangement for probably a decade before I noticed it again. There's a particular ache in a lower back that spent 30 years climbing and descending. No amount of stretching in the morning ever quite talks it out of you. I carry that ache the way some men carry a wallet without thinking about it until somebody in a nice dress asks why you're limping at a party. That same week, Trey called me from his dorm at the University of Georgia, mostly just to talk, which he still does more than most sons his age. "You good, Pop?" he asked the way he always does, like he can hear something in my voice before I say a word. "Working," I told him, which is the answer I give when the honest one would take longer than either of us has time for. My grandmother, Modessa, used to tell me that a man showing his children his tiredness isn't weakness. It's an inheritance. The real mistake, she said, is hiding the tiredness and passing down the hiding instead. I hadn't thought about that saying in years until I hung up the phone that night and realized I'd done exactly what she warned against. 2 days after that mixer, I did something I still haven't told anyone, not even Deborah. Trey was $600 short on his spring tuition at the University of Georgia. A gap JP, the financial aid office, found at the last possible hour. I didn't want Sylvia to know how thin our account had gotten by then. Not after everything she'd already said about money that year. So on a Saturday morning, I told her I had a job site out past Ellijay, which wasn't exactly a lie. I drove the truck up into the hills with my grandfather's climbing spurs wrapped in a shop towel on the passenger seat. He'd hand-forged them himself back when he still worked the Chattahoochee timber lines before the mills started closing one by one. The steel had gone dark with age, the leather straps soft as a glove from 40 years of his hands, and then 20 more of mine. A collector out there paid $1,100 cash folded twice and didn't ask where they came from or what they meant to me. He held them up to the light like he was checking a gemstone, turned them over once, and set them in a velvet-lined case without another word. I stood in that gravel parking lot for a minute after he'd gone back inside, just holding the empty shop towel. It was the only thing of my grandfather's I had left, besides one small brass pocket level and a saying about roots. I drove home and wired the money to the bursar's office from a gas station parking lot on Highway 52, engine still running. When Sylvia asked that night how the Ellijay job had gone, I told her I'd found a client who paid early. She nodded, already scrolling through something on her phone, and never asked which client. I have thought about that shop towel more times than I can count since then, folded up in a kitchen drawer, still faintly smelling of oil and cedar. You can tell a healthy root system by what you can't see, my grandfather used to say. The real proof is always underground. It wasn't always like this between us. 22 years ago at our wedding at Mount Moriah Baptist on Auburn Avenue. Sylvia stood up during the reception. She told the whole room she'd married a man who could build anything with his hands and never once bragged about it. Her mother cried. My grandfather, still alive, then wore his one good suit and danced with her twice. I used to think that toast was the truest thing anybody had ever said about me. Some nights lying awake next to her, I still believe it was. 9 years ago, I broke my ankle falling out of a water oak on a job in Marietta. Sylvia took 2 weeks off work without being asked and slept on a cot next to my hospital bed, both nights before they discharged me. She never once made me feel like a burden for needing her. She still checks that ankle before rain out of habit, even now. I don't tell that part of the story much because it complicates the version people want to hear. But it's true, and leaving it out would make her smaller than she actually was to me for a very long time. Here is the surface of it, the part I can say plainly without dressing it up. At Preston's holiday party the year before, Sylvia introduced me to 4 of her co-workers as our landscaping guy. When one of them asked what that meant exactly, she said, "He does yards," and moved the conversation along before I had a chance to answer for myself. The 4 of them laughed at something a moment later, some joke I hadn't caught. I laughed along too, a half beat behind the way you do when you're trying to look like you belong somewhere you've already been told you don't. I stood there holding a glass of punch I didn't want in the one good sweater I own and said nothing. I didn't correct her that night either. The week before the hearing, I drove out to Cedar Hollow one last time to walk the boundary line before I filed my final recommendation. Naomi met me out there, unannounced, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and a folding chair she never once sat in. "Word's getting around that Preston's people are nervous about something," she told me, watching a hawk circle over the ridge. "You planning on telling me what that something is?" "Not yet," I said. "Not until it's official." She didn't push. That's one of the things I've always respected about Naomi. She knows the difference between curiosity and a right to know. We stood together near the grandmother poplar for a long while, not talking, just listening to the creek work its way over the rocks the way it had for longer than either of our families had been in Georgia. "Whatever happens at that hearing," she said finally, "this tree doesn't care about any of it. It's just going to keep doing what it does." I thought about that sentence more than once in the days that followed. Not because I couldn't have. I could have told that whole room about the easement letter folded up in my kitchen drawer, about the 230 acres, and about a signature that would eventually matter more than anyone in that ballroom understood. I kept it folded instead, the same way I'd kept everything else folded for going on 22 years. Deborah asked me once why I never just told Sylvia's people what I actually did for a living. I didn't have a good answer for her that day. The closest I've come to one since is this: I wanted her proud of the man, not impressed by the title. I'm still not sure even now whether that was patience or just another way of hiding. 4 days before the hearing, my cousin Deborah called me from the credit union parking lot on her lunch break. Her voice was low, like she didn't want anybody walking past to hear it. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said. "Then don't." I told her because I could hear in her voice that whatever it was would cost her something to say out loud. She was quiet for a second. "Just watch the joint retirement account before the hearing, Marcus. That's all I'm going to say tonight." She hung up before I could ask her anything else. I sat in my truck in the church parking lot for a long time after that engine off, staring at nothing in particular. "So here's what I want to know from you before we go any further. Was I wise to stay quiet through years of that quietly building the case that actually mattered? Or was I a fool for never correcting her the first time she said it?" Comment team quiet or team correct. I'm reading every single one of them. The morning of the hearing. I got to the county building on Pryor Street 40 minutes early. My badge was already clipped to my jacket, and I took my seat at the reviewer's table before the room filled in around me. Sylvia and Preston came in together, laughing at something between them. They took seats near the front without once looking my direction. Somewhere behind me near the back doors, I heard them open, slow and careful. Whoever it was didn't seem to want to be noticed yet. I didn't turn around. Not yet. But I heard 3 chairs creak as half the room did it for me. I finally turned around, and I saw Naomi Carter standing just inside the double doors, a folder tucked under one arm. Naomi runs the community garden 2 blocks from the Cedar Hollow access road. That garden has fed half the seniors on that side of the county for going on 9 years now. She caught my eye. First gave me the smallest nod, and then walked straight up the center aisle like she had every right to be there. Because she did. The county had listed the Garden Coalition as an interested party back in the spring, and nobody on Preston's side had bothered to check the list twice. Sylvia turned to see what everyone else was looking at, and I watched the color drain out of her face in real time. She recovered fast the way she always does, straightening her blazer and turning back around like nothing had happened. But I'd seen it. Whatever Naomi meant to that morning, Sylvia hadn't planned for it. Naomi and I worked together for 6 years before she left the county extension office to run the garden full-time. That was back when I was still doing straight landscaping. And neither of us had any idea what our lives would turn into. She'd buried a husband young, raised 2 boys mostly alone, and still shown up every Saturday morning to that garden with seed packets in her coat pocket. Nobody in Collier Heights had a bad word to say about Naomi Carter. And in a neighborhood like ours, that's its own kind of credential. The hearing room itself was smaller than I expected for something that mattered this much. Maybe 80 folding chairs under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly when the room got quiet enough to notice. A framed photograph of the county seal hung crooked behind the clerk's table. It was the kind of detail nobody ever fixes because nobody's ever the one whose job it is. I'd been in that room a dozen times before for smaller reviews. Always in the back, always unnoticed. This was the first time I'd sat at the reviewer's table instead of a folding chair in the last row. My knees remembered the difference before the rest of me caught up. I want to stop here and tell you something about Sylvia that took me most of our marriage to understand. Her father lost their house in Birmingham to foreclosure when she was 12 years old, and the bank changed the locks while she was still at school that day. Her mother worked 2 jobs after that, a diner in the morning and a cleaning service at night. Sylvia grew up promising herself she would never again stand on a porch that didn't belong to her. That fear never really left her. It just learned to wear better clothes. Every room she walked into. After that, she was doing math. The rest of us couldn't see, calculating exactly how far she was from that porch on any given day. I don't say any of this to excuse what came next. I say it because a person's cruelty usually has an address, and hers was a house in Birmingham that stopped being hers when she was 12. My grandmother used to say fear makes a poor architect. It builds walls where a door would have done just fine, and calls the walls safety. I saw that fear in small places over the years, if I'm honest about looking for it. In the way she flinched whenever a bill arrived, a few days late, even ones we could easily cover. In the way she never once, in 22 years, let a checking account balance drop below a certain number. A number she never told to me, but that I eventually learned just by watching her face. In the way she introduced herself at parties by her title before her name. Like the title was the part that couldn't be repossessed. I used to find that last one almost funny. I don't anymore. The county clerk called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock sharp and read through the agenda in the flat voice clerks use for agendas everywhere. Preston stood up first, buttoned his jacket, and gave his pitch about jobs and tax revenue and a resort that would put the county on the map. He had slides, a clean gray deck with the Cedar Hollow logo, rendered in a font that probably cost somebody more than my truck was worth. 400 construction jobs over 3 years, he said, and 60 permanent positions after that. Most of them would go to local hires, he promised. If the county approved the incentive package alongside the permit, a woman 2 rows in front of me was nodding along with every number the way people nod at numbers they've already decided to believe. He was good at it. I'll give him that much even now. Preston had a way of making a room want to agree with him before he'd finished a sentence, a gift I've never had and probably never will. I remembered the first time I met him at a 4th of July cookout 2 summers back. He'd asked me 4 separate questions about tree work in the first 10 minutes and actually listened to every answer. I liked him that day. That's the part people leave out when they tell stories like this one. How easy it is to like the person who ends up costing you the most. He'd built 3 resorts from nothing before this one, and I'd read enough about the first 2 to know they weren't scams, not exactly. People genuinely liked working for him. That was the part that made all of this harder to sit with later, not easier. Then the clerk said, "And the county will hear from the Federal Reviewer of Record on the Cedar Hollow easement, Mr. Marcus Delaine." A ripple went through the front rows. Sylvia's head turned so fast I heard her earring hit her collar. "That's not," she started to say to Preston low. I was already standing up, already walking toward the podium, in the same boots she'd been laughing at 20 minutes earlier. The walk from the reviewer's table to the podium is maybe 15 feet. It felt considerably longer that morning, every eye in the room finding me somewhere around the third step. 2 years before that hearing, Sylvia came home from a firm dinner, insisting we needed a membership at the Ashworth Country Club, the same one Preston belonged to, because appearances mattered for the kind of clients she was chasing. $6,000 a year due up-front money. We didn't have sitting anywhere close to available. So I drove down to the credit union on Cascade Road and took a second mortgage against the last 11 acres of my father's land in South Georgia. It was the only piece of it we hadn't already sold off a decade earlier. The loan officer that day, a young man about Trey's age, pulled up my file and paused. "Wait, are you the Delaine doing the federal review on Cedar Hollow?" he asked, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "My uncle's on that survey crew. Man, that's serious work." I signed the mortgage papers without correcting the wonder in his voice. It was the only room I'd been in for weeks where somebody used the word serious about anything I did. That land had been in my father's name since 1963. Longleaf pine and a stand of pecan trees he planted the year I was born. I used to spend every summer down there as a boy barefoot most of June. I learned to tell a healthy tree from a sick one before I could tie my own shoes properly. Mortgaging it a second time felt like handing over a piece of my own chest quietly in a fluorescent-lit office on a Tuesday afternoon. I drove home, handed Sylvia the club membership paperwork, and never once mentioned where the money had actually come from. Patience isn't the same as doing nothing, my grandfather used to say. Even a seed underground is working. I stepped up to the microphone and set my folder down on the podium. The room had gone quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet, when nobody's sure yet what they're about to hear. "My name is Marcus Delaine," I said. "I'm a certified arborist, and I'm the federal reviewer assigned to this easement." Sylvia's face didn't move. Preston's did. "I don't work for anyone in this room," I said. "I work for the trees." My hand found my jacket pocket without me deciding to move it. I felt the small brass weight of my grandfather's pocket level against my knuckles, cool at first, then warm from being carried. I didn't take it out. I just held it there, while I talked through the survey findings the way some men hold a rosary or a coin. If you've ever had to prove in a room full of strangers that the work you do with your hands is worth as much as work done in a suit, stay with me. You know the particular steadiness it takes to keep your voice from shaking while you do it. I know the smell of pine sap that never fully washes out of a good pair of work gloves. I know the sound a chainsaw makes right before the blade catches and the half-second of quiet after it does. I know what it costs a man to stand in front of people who've spent years deciding he's beneath them. I know what it costs him to speak anyway, plainly, without raising his voice, even once. I know the exact grip of a harness. After 6 hours in a canopy, the way it leaves red lines across your shoulders that don't fade until the next morning. I know what it means to finally say the word arborist out loud in a room that had already decided before you opened your mouth what kind of man you were. When the clerk opened the floor for public comment, I expected silence, or maybe one of Preston's investors reading a prepared statement. Instead, Deborah stood up from the third row, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the second microphone like she'd been rehearsing it in her car. "My name is Deborah Fontaine," she said. "I'm a loan officer at Peachtree Community Credit Union, and I'm Marcus Delaine's first cousin." A few people shifted in their seats. "For 6 years, an anonymous account has been funding an apprenticeship program," she said. "It trains young people from Collier Heights and Bankhead in urban forestry and tree care. 11 kids have gone through it so far. 3 now hold their own state certifications. I process the transfers every quarter. I wasn't supposed to say whose account it comes out of. I'm saying it anyway, because this county is about to decide whether that man knows what he's protecting." Sylvia's mother, sitting 2 rows behind her, made a small sound and put a hand over her mouth. I found out 3 days later that the family group chat had already turned on Deborah before she'd even made it back to her car that morning. Her own aunt didn't speak to her again for the better part of a year. Deborah had her own reasons for standing up that morning, ones she didn't explain to me until much later, over coffee at her kitchen table in the spring. Her own father had walked out on her mother when Deborah was 9. For years afterward, the family had quietly agreed never to speak his name at holidays, as if silence could undo what he'd done. I got tired of watching this family protect people instead of protecting each other, she told me. I wasn't going to do it again, not for something this size. I didn't have anything to say back to that, so I just refilled her cup instead. One of the 3 kids who'd gone on to certification, a young woman named Simone, was sitting in the 4th row that morning. She used to ride her bike to my job sites just to watch years ago, back when she was still in high school. Neither of us had known the other would be there. She told me afterward she'd cried into her jacket sleeve so nobody would see. I hadn't told her either all those years, exactly where her stipend checks came from. The program started small for kids and a borrowed pickup truck. I funded it out of side jobs I never told Sylvia about because I didn't want the conversation about where the money was going instead. By the 3rd year, the county extension office had noticed enough to offer classroom space for free, though they still don't know who's actually behind it. I used to drive those kids out to job sites on Saturday mornings, same as my grandfather once drove me. I taught them to read Bark and Canopy, the way he'd taught me decades before any of them were born. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing at that podium while Deborah talked. It wasn't pride. It was something closer to shame, the kind that comes from watching a private thing turned inside out in front of strangers. I hadn't even decided myself yet whether I was ready to show it. I had built that apprenticeship program, the same way I'd built everything else in my life, quietly on purpose. I didn't trust rooms like that one to receive it kindly if I said it out loud myself. Hearing Deborah say it for me didn't feel like winning. It felt like watching somebody hand over a gift I'd spent years wrapping before I'd finished deciding who it was for. That's the part of this whole story most people get wrong when they hear it secondhand. Being seen isn't always relief. Sometimes it's just a different kind of exposed. Some men spend 40 years pruning everybody else's tree and forget to look up at their own. I was starting to understand I might be one of them. Most people in that room, including me, for about 30 seconds assumed the worst thing about to happen was Sylvia's face on the 6 o'clock news. Naomi walked up to the podium, next opened her folder, and proved all of us wrong. I'd like to enter into the record a prior environmental waiver submitted for this project in March, she said, sliding a copy to the clerk. It bears the signature of Vernon Akabe, the previous federal reviewer for this district. Mr. Akabe retired to Savannah 3 years ago. I called him yesterday. He has never seen this document in his life. Naomi told me later how she'd found it sitting on my own porch steps with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. The Garden Coalition had requested every public filing on Cedar Hollow going back 5 years standard practice before any hearing. A volunteer paralegal from the coalition had noticed the signature looked wrong against Vernon's other filings. Vernon always dotted his I's with a little flourish like his mother taught him in some one-room schoolhouse in the 50s, Naomi said. Whoever signed that waiver didn't know that. Just went straight through. It was the smallest detail imaginable, a dotted I, and it had unraveled the whole thing. Vernon himself called me that evening. Voice thin with age over the phone line, mostly just to make sure I was doing all right after everything. Some men build things to last, he told me. Others just build things to close. You learn to tell the difference eventually, Marcus. I hadn't expected to hear from him at all, let alone something that steadied me as much as that call did. The room went a different kind of quiet than it had for Deborah. Preston stood up so fast his chair scraped against the tile. That's a clerical error, he said. But his voice had lost the polish it had all morning. Forging a federal reviewer's signature isn't a clerical error. It's a crime that carries real prison time, and everybody in that room, old enough to read a newspaper, understood the difference immediately. One of Preston's investors, a heavy-set man in a gray suit I recognized from the mixer, stood up without a word. He walked straight out the double doors phone already at his ear. 2 more followed within the minute. Preston kept talking something about due diligence and third-party contractors, but nobody at the front tables was listening to him anymore. I watched him realize it in real time, the exact moment his voice lost its audience. Sylvia watched it too from a few feet away, and I saw something shift across her face that had nothing to do with me at all. She'd hitched her whole plan to a man who was now visibly coming apart in front of a room full of people who mattered to both their futures. I don't think she'd let herself imagine that outcome. Not once in all the months of quiet planning it must have taken to get that money moved. For a second, I felt something close to pity. Then I remembered what his forgery would have done to 230 acres. My grandfather had taught me to love. I stayed seated at the reviewer's table a moment longer than I needed to. I watched the room empty in pieces, watching who walked toward Sylvia and who very deliberately did not. The clerk called a 15-minute recess to let the county attorney review Naomi's document. The room broke into the kind of noise a room makes when nobody knows where to look. Sylvia hadn't moved from her seat. I walked past her on my way to the hallway, close enough to smell the same perfume she'd worn to our anniversary dinner 2 months earlier. She grabbed my sleeve just above the wrist, harder than I expected. "Marcus," she said, "we need to talk, now before this goes any further." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, then back up at her face. There was something in it I hadn't seen there in years, and I still hadn't decided whether it was fear for herself or fear for me. "All right," I said, "let's talk." Sylvia pulled me by the sleeve into the alcove, near the double doors, half in the hallway and half still visible to the room. I want to be fair to her here because fairness is the only thing I have left to offer that costs me nothing. Some part of her, I believe, had spent that whole recess deciding whether to reach for me or to reach for the exit. She had built a life out of never needing anyone to catch her. Now the one person positioned to catch her was the one man she'd spent years making sure never got the chance to try. I watched her hands, not her face, because hands tell the truth faster. They were shaking just slightly around the strap of her purse. Her thumb kept running along the same worn spot on the leather, over and over. It was a habit I recognized from every hard conversation we'd had in 22 years of marriage. Through the doorway behind her, I could see the county attorney huddled with the clerk over Naomi's document. Beyond them, Preston was already working the room again, laughing at something one of the remaining investors had said. He hadn't looked our way once. I could smell coffee on her breath from the break table. Underneath it faintly was the same lavender lotion she'd used every morning since before we were married. Some habits outlast the reasons you started them. She looked at me like she expected me to walk away the second I had the chance. "Marcus, please." She started quiet just for me. Preston appeared behind her before she could finish. 2 of the remaining investors trailing him, all of them talking at once. Sylvia straightened up fast, the way she does when an audience arrives. Her voice changed to match it, brighter and louder than it had been a second earlier. Aimed past me at the small crowd gathering near the doors. "Look at him, still in his work boots, standing in a room like this one," she said loud enough for the table behind her to catch it. An older woman beside her laughed into a wine glass. "Bless his heart, at least he tries." "Some men just aren't built for rooms like this one, Marcus," Preston said, smiling like he'd done me a favor. "No shame in it." Somebody near the bar didn't bother lowering their voice. Cute that he still shows up, though. I set my thermos down on the registration table and let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "No shame in it at all," I said. One of the investors turned on Preston immediately, not on me. "Is it true the withdrawal traced back to your firm's founder equity round came through Sylvia Delaine's personal account?" he asked, phone already recording. Preston's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. His hand went to straighten a tie that was already straight, a small unconscious gesture. I'd watched him make that same gesture once before the night he'd first shaken hands with Sylvia at that country club. He caught himself doing it and stopped, but not fast enough. "That's between Sylvia and her bank," he said. "Not my business what she does with her own money." Sylvia's mouth opened, then closed. "That sounds like a you problem, Sylvia," Preston added. I was already turning to shake the investor's hand instead of hers, already 3 feet further away than he'd been a second earlier. Another investor. A woman I recognized from the mixer pulled her phone out and stepped away from the group entirely, already dialing someone. 61,000, she said into the phone, not bothering to lower her voice. Out of a joint retirement account. That's not a rounding error, that's a paper trail. Sylvia's hand found the back of a nearby chair and gripped it. I noticed her knuckles first pale against the dark wood before I noticed anything about her face at all. I had never seen a person's whole face fall apart that quietly. No tears, no raised voice, just the particular stillness of someone watching every version of a future she'd built disappear at once. The older woman who'd laughed into her wine glass earlier had already put the glass down on a nearby table untouched. She was watching Sylvia now the way people watch weather turning. A second investor asked Preston a follow-up question about the March waiver, and he answered it smoothly. I was already 3 sentences into rebuilding himself in front of everyone. Sylvia stood alone in the middle of that hallway for a full 10 seconds before she turned toward me instead of toward any of them. The investors and the crowd around Preston drifted further off, chasing the bigger story. And for the moment, it was just the two of us again in that alcove. Sylvia turned to face me, and whatever had been holding her together in front of the room let go. "You could have told me," she said low, not performing anymore. Federal Reviewer, 14 months, Marcus. You let me stand in that ballroom and call you the landscaping guy for 14 months. I didn't answer right away. You let me be ashamed of a lie you were the one keeping, she said. That part's not just on me. She wiped under one eye with the back of her hand quick, like she was angry at herself for even that much. You don't know what it's like to grow up watching the bank change your locks while you're still at school, she said. To swear you'd never stand on a porch that wasn't yours again. I know some of it, I said. You told me once a long time ago. Then you should have understood why I needed Preston's world more than I needed yours. I have turned that sentence over more times than I want to admit since that morning. She wasn't wrong. I knew about the $61,400, I said quietly. I've known since Deborah called me 4 days ago. Sylvia went very still. Her hand still holding the strap of her purse stopped moving entirely. I could have brought it to the county attorney this morning, I said. Fraud wire records, all of it. I didn't. Why not? She said barely above a whisper. Because destroying you in front of these people was never the point, I said. Stopping the bulldozers was the point. She didn't say anything to that. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, worked hard enough, you'd eventually choose me on your own, I said. Without me ever having to make my case for it. That was the truest thing I said to her that whole morning. It cost me more than anything Preston or the county attorney could have taken. Sylvia's eyes were wet now, though she still hadn't let a single tear actually fall. It was a discipline I recognized, because I'd spent most of my own life practicing the same one. Sylvia reached for my arm again, and this time I let her hold it for exactly 3 seconds before I stepped back. Her fingers left 4 pale marks on my forearm that were still faintly visible when I got home that night. I picked up my folder from the podium where I'd left it and nodded once to the clerk. I walked out through the same double doors Naomi had come through that morning. The cold hit me first, the particular kind of Georgia cold that shows up in late fall and doesn't announce itself until you're already outside in it. My breath fogged in front of me for a second before it disappeared. I didn't look back at Sylvia. I didn't look for Preston either. Deborah was waiting by my truck in the parking lot, arms crossed against the cold. She didn't say a word, just fell into step beside me toward the driver's side door. You didn't have to do that in there, I told her. I know, she said. I did it anyway. I drove out of that parking lot with the pocket level still in my jacket pocket, same as it had been all morning. I still couldn't have told you exactly why I'd never once used it. I would understand that by the end of the week. I just didn't know it yet. I drove home the long way down Cascade Road, past the barber shop, its lights already off for the day. The city didn't care what had happened to me that morning. It never does. And there's a strange mercy in that, if you let yourself see it that way, instead of the other way. Somebody was still out walking a dog on DeLoe Drive like it was any other Tuesday. And in a strange way, I found that steadying rather than cruel. The oaks along our street had already dropped most of their leaves for the season. My headlights caught them scattered across the pavement, curled up at the edges, the way they do right before the first real cold sets in. I could see a light on in the kitchen window before I even pulled into the driveway, a small yellow square in the dark. My phone buzzed twice at a red light. Sylvia. I'm sorry. Can we please talk tonight? I read it twice, thumb hovering over the screen. Then I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat without answering. Whatever I owed her an answer to that text, wasn't it? Not yet. It sat there, the rest of the drive home screen dark, next to the folder I'd carried out of that hearing room. A storm doesn't test a tree's leaves, my grandfather used to say. It tests what's been growing quiet under the dirt for 30 years. I found Trey's car already in the driveway when I pulled in, headlights still ticking as they cooled. He must have driven straight from Athens the second Deborah called him. Inside, I went looking for a clean shirt and found the old shop towel instead, folded in the same kitchen drawer I'd hidden it in over a year ago. I hadn't thrown it away. I'm not sure I ever could have. I carried it out to the kitchen and set it on the table next to the 2 coffee mugs Trey had already pulled down from the cabinet without being asked. Deborah told me some of it, he said, filling the kettle. Not all of it. She said that was your part to tell. I sat down across from him at the table my grandfather built, the one with the water ring near the far edge that none of us had ever bothered to sand out. My phone buzzed once more while the kettle heated. Naomi this time, just 3 words. You did good. I didn't answer that one either, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust my hands not to shake typing it. I told him most of it, the letter, the acres, the $61,400, Deborah's phone call, Preston's forged waiver. Trey listened without interrupting, which he's always been better at than I was at his age. When I finished, he turned his mug slowly on the table for a moment before he spoke. Did you ever think about just telling her who you really were, Pop? He asked. Like sitting her down and just saying it plain. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than that. It was genuine curiosity, the kind only a 24-year-old who hasn't learned to be careful yet can still ask out loud. I didn't have an answer ready. I don't know, Trey, I said. I think some part of me wanted her to see it without me having to point at it. He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him, and also didn't both at once. You know I want to run that apprenticeship program myself someday, he said. After grad school, take it off your hands. It's not really mine to hand off, I said. It was never about ownership. I know, he said. That's kind of the point I'm making, Pop. I looked at my son across that table for a long moment, 24 years old, and already understanding something it had taken me most of my life to learn. You did right by those trees, Pop, he said, finally standing up to rinse his mug. Whatever else people want to argue about. That was enough for one night. Ma Odessa used to say a man can pour his whole self into a cup somebody else has already decided not to drink from. I heard her voice say it in my head, clear as anything, sitting at that table with my son. Trey went up to the guest room around 11, and I sat alone at the kitchen table with 2 cold mugs and the shop towel between them. There was still one conversation left to have, though. The one that would finally put the last 22 years to rest, one way or the other. I woke up before 6 the next morning, out of habit, and put on the same old flannel shirt I've worn on porch mornings for going on 15 years. I made 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. Trey was still asleep upstairs, and the house had that particular stillness a house gets when everyone in it is finally resting after a hard stretch. Frost had come in overnight, thin and silver, across the grass, the first real one of the season. The porch light was still burning from the night before. I'd forgotten to turn it off, and for once, I didn't mind the wasted electric. I sat down in my grandfather's rocking chair, the one that still creaks on the left runner no matter how many times I've oiled it. I took the pocket level out of my jacket pocket for the first time in 6 years. I set it flat on the porch rail. The bubble drifted, then settled dead center. I sat there a long moment, just looking at it, the way you look at a thing you've been afraid to check for 6 years. Level. My grandfather gave me that thing the week before he died and told me to check if the ground was level before I built anything on it. I always thought he meant foundations. Sitting on that porch, coffee going cold beside me, I finally understood he meant something else entirely. What I hadn't forgiven wasn't Sylvia calling me the landscaping guy at that holiday party the year before. It was the 10-year-old boy who used to believe his own father wasn't a man worth introducing. A rich landowner once called my father just the help right in front of both of us, and I never once saw my father correct him. I'd spent 45 years building a life sturdy enough that nobody could ever call me small again. In all that building, I never once checked whether the boy underneath it had actually forgiven himself. He hadn't. Not until that morning on that porch, with a level bubble sitting dead center for the first time in longer than I could remember. My grandfather used to say, roots don't ask permission to hold the ground together, that they just do it season after season, whether anybody's looking or not. I understood finally sitting there that he hadn't only been talking about trees. He'd been talking about men like him and men like my father, and eventually, men like me. Sylvia and I are separated now, quietly. The way most true things in our marriage ended up happening. No lawyers screaming across a table, no ballroom scene for the 6 o'clock news. Just two people who spent 22 years mistaking silence for peace, finally admitting the difference out loud. Dignity at our age isn't a speech my grandfather used to say. It's a Saturday spent walking your own land instead of tending somebody else's opinion of you. A man's worth isn't what people say about him in a ballroom. It's what he plants when nobody's there to watch it grow. The county denied the Cedar Hollow expansion permanently 3 weeks after that hearing. That decision cited the easement review I'd filed the year before. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, my grandmother used to say. It's just deciding the weight isn't worth carrying into the next season. I'm still working on that one most days, same as everybody else I know. The grandmother poplar is still standing on that hillside, and I drive out to check on her most Saturdays, same as I always did. Preston is under investigation now, and I understand 2 more of his old projects are getting a second look. The apprenticeship program has 19 kids in it this year, more than we've ever had at once. The county extension office finally asked to put my name on the paperwork instead of leaving the account anonymous. I said yes to that. Finally, after Deborah gave me a look across her kitchen table that told me she wasn't asking. Naomi's Garden Coalition successfully petitioned to have the whole 230 acres added to the state's Heritage Forest Registry that spring. No developer will be back at that podium again anytime soon. Trey drove out with me last Saturday, and we stood together under the grandmother poplar the way I once stood there alone. He put his hand flat against her bark, same as I'd taught him years ago, and didn't say anything for a long while. Neither did I. I never did file anything against Sylvia myself. That was never the part of this I needed to win. Deborah's aunt finally called her back around Christmas, 6 weeks after the hearing. The two of them talked for almost an hour with the phone on speaker in my kitchen. I didn't say much during that call. I just listened and refilled both their coffee cups, when they ran low the way I'd learned to do, for people carrying something heavy. Trey drove out to Ellijay on his own that same December and tracked down the collector who'd bought my grandfather's climbing spurs. He bought them back for 4 times what I'd sold them for. He didn't tell me until he handed them to me on Christmas morning, wrapped in the same kind of shop towel I'd carried them out in. I held them for a long time before I said anything. "You didn't have to do that," I told him. "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." It was the same thing Deborah had told me in that parking lot, word for word, and I don't think either of them knew it. Before I let you go tonight, I want to leave you with 3 small things. A story like this one isn't worth much if it doesn't turn into something you can actually do. If you are a widow still setting 2 coffee cups out of habit, pull the second one down anyway, tomorrow morning. Fill it and let it sit across from you for exactly as long as it takes to drink your own. That's not weakness. That's just love that hasn't finished arriving somewhere yet. If you just retired and don't know what to do with your hands anymore, go find the toolbox, the sewing kit, or the recipe box. Whatever built your reputation for 30 years, use it on something small this week, even if nobody's watching. Especially if nobody's watching. If you have a grandchild who's being quietly underestimated by somebody who ought to know better, better take them out on your porch this weekend. Put something warm in their hands and tell them the truth about how long it took you to believe your own worth. They're listening more than you think. My name is Marcus Delaine. This has been another story from our channel. The details here are fictional, but the feeling underneath them is real for more people than any of us will ever know.